in light of some stuff that's come out recently about a specific kids curriculum, how do we here at Northwest Gospel Church choose our kids curriculum? Why do we write our own curriculum? And what does that whole thing look like here at our local church? That's what's today on the To Be the Church podcast. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler, and Andrew's gone. Ben's gone for a long time, and so we have a very special guest today. It's been a minute since you've been on the show.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time I was here.
Yeah,
baptism, shepherd baptism.
Okay, yeah, Courtney's here.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to have you.
Yeah,
Courtney has been at this church in Northwest Gospel Church since you were 8 years old.
24 years.
24 years, nice. And been on staff pretty much since college, right?
Yeah, I've been an intern off and on, officially like on the paid staff in 2015.
2015, so nice. Yeah. About 8 years there. And you've done a lot of different roles at this church. You spent a long time just recently as one of our youth ministers, but you've made a transition out of that and into something new. So I actually overheard somebody asking you what your title was the other day, and you told them, and they were like, well, isn't everybody that? So you are now you are our discipleship minister. Yeah. And so what does that entail?
Yeah, so it involves a lot of areas of equipping and training people across the board. So it includes some of our deacon stuff. It includes kind of forming and shaping our adult education. There's like some community group aspects to it, and still helping to train and equip teachers in different areas from youth through kids and all of that. So at the moment, it's a lot of systems, buildings, projects, all of that, but involves people, obviously. Yeah.
So what sparked the change?
It's kind of a combination of things. It's like where life circumstances hit organizational change, so I mean, having done youth ministry for like 13 years, and then, just in the last couple years, having gotten married and had a kid, it's just like the demands of youth ministry is very high, and it's very, very relational. Like you just make a lot of time for students and a lot of time for kids in order for that to really have some success. And I just didn't feel very successful in it any longer. And when I was doing my job well, I was not serving my family well. And so just kind of looking for a change, looking for a switch, we had talked about like, hey, here's some things I could work on if I made a switch. And it happened to kind of align with NGC's goals for the year. So it was like one of those perfect moments. Yeah,
that's pretty sweet. I remember toward the end of last year, we were doing some annual review stuff, and we were coming up as an executive team with some goals for this 2023 year, and we hadn't shared those yet with anybody. And it was just Andrew, me, Nathan had seen them. Maybe a couple of our marketplace elders. That's our new word for it, by the way. So guys who don't work here at the church but are elders, and so maybe they had seen it, but that was it. And then you filled out there's a question on the review process. It's like, what do you want to change in your role, or like what could possibly change in your role in 2023? And you were like, I don't know if when the time is for this, but here's where I feel like my desires are heading. And it was 3 specific things that you're like, I'd like to do this. I'd like to do this. I'd like to do this. And there were 3 things that were on our goal list for NGC in 2023. It was oh, let's start having that conversation now. And so, the transition has happened. Now you still have some overlap with student ministry and youth and stuff because of the teachers aspect and training, stuff like that. But I don't know. I'm excited. I think I told somebody recently, it's what Courtney has been and provided for our students, she now gets to be and provide for our whole church. And that is a huge win for us. And so I'm really excited about that. We have a listener question that actually relates to some of that stuff. And whenever I was like, oh, you want to join the podcast? And I had the perfect question. I was like, oh, this is a Courtney question for sure. Nice. But before we get there, last week on the podcast, Andrew mentioned the fact that Ben's gone for 3 months. Mm-hmm. I leave for 3 months in a few weeks. And so he said, send us your summer podcast ideas. Send us the things that you think we should do over the course of the summer. And so I would like to give you the opportunity. Do you have any
summer podcast
ideas, things that he could do
by himself,
or with
Oh, that's right, because you and Ben are gone. I'm putting the dots together now.
Yeah. What could Andrew do for this podcast?
You know what we need to do is do it on the road and do a chicken coop building tutorial.
Yeah, he told me
he's very proud about that.
Well, have you seen it?
It looks huge.
Yeah, it's like
I haven't seen it in person.
It's a house. It's not a chicken coop. He told me he was doing a chicken coop. I was like, cool, man, whatever. And then he sent me a video of it. I was like, oh, that is that's a chicken mansion.
It should be like Andrew at home and just him taking care of chickens and stuff.
Yeah, we've had some good suggestions already.
Okay.
Somebody said, like their pitch was this: 2 of NGC's teachers may be heretics. Let's find out on this week's podcast, and then have 2 of our teachers or preachers who disagree on something argue about it on the podcast. Okay. That'd be fun. Okay. Somebody else said, invite like people in leadership to tell their testimonies. It's a pretty good idea.
That's a great idea.
Somebody else said, have ministry teams come on and like kind of outline what they do to serve the church. And so they were like, isn't there a ministry of like guys and their sons who help old people with their houses? Like, I'd love to hear more about that. And
it's like describe a ministry badly.
Yeah. And then somebody else said, hey, please invite my women's inductive Bible study on the podcast and help us study a chapter that we're finishing up Genesis by the end of June. Let us come in and do that on the air. That'd be kind of fun.
That's great.
So anyway, yeah, chicken coop tutorial.
Yeah, that's not as good as those ones.
Yeah, I thought we'd do like a whole summer of AI,
that's
like
awful.
Just let our, our online consciences
take over the
say
world.
what's up. So,
oh man.
Okay. So here's the actual question that I wanted to discuss with you. It says this, it says, hey y'all, I was listening to the Unshaken Faith podcast, and they were talking about the orange curriculum for kids and the dangers it has in it by leaning more progressive as well as moralistic. The episode is really worth the listen, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on choosing the curriculum that NGC uses for kids programs and the why behind choosing it. Would also be great to hear y'all discuss how to best discern what curriculum is used in the church overall. And so, yeah, let's we could talk about kids ministry specifically, but you've done years of work in our family life area, and the choosing of curriculum there, the creation of curriculum there, and let's just talk about. I'll just ask a bunch of questions. We'll go from there.
Okay.
So let's say that you're at a spot where you have to use somebody else's. You're not at a spot where you can create something from scratch. We would always prefer to create something from scratch on our team, but we can't always, right? There's just seasons where it's just not feasible. So what are the primary things you're looking for as you're looking at curriculum for our church?
Yeah, I mean, one is there's kind of a two approach in our like theology, and one is like centrality of the Bible, but then it's like, how do they use the Bible? Because there's a lot of curriculums that can use the Bible, but their application points are faulty. Or, their character studies in the Bible, but it's the, be like David, be like Daniel, be like that. And that's not the way we preach the Bible. So it's not the way we want to like teach in our curriculums either. And I think there's been a huge wave of resources that have come out of like Christ-centered curriculum, which is super awesome. And so anything like that can be a really helpful tool to get started and get going. I mean, for heaven's sake, like people like the Bible Project are putting the stuff I got in college for free online, which is awesome. But there's a lot of resources like that out there for kids. But then every single curriculum you have to contextualize into your area, so even as I'm looking for, like for a bit when I was looking at the kids curriculum, I was looking for, it was super clear main idea, super clear passage, and then some way to interact with that. For kids, usually you need some kind of activity, you need some kind of something. And some of those curriculums are built for like big groups, and depending on the size of your group, you can't do a huge activity, or sometimes it's built for small groups and you have to like make that into something bigger. And so I think at the time, like I was just cutting and choosing parts of that curriculum for just anyone to be able to teach. So it's like, here's the text, here's the main idea, here's some options for an activity, and like then you take it from there and kind of cut out a lot of the other fluffs. Some of those things have really great like design wise, like great like memory verse cards, and like all that kind of stuff is always usually pretty great. But
yeah, I think as I've helped our ministry team like look for curriculum and stuff like that, you said it a minute ago, but they teach it how we preach it, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of do that in all of our areas. We do that in music. We do that in like thinking about preachers for events and stuff like that. It's like we want what the main thing to be the main thing, and like to we don't want a passage in kids' church to contradict how our teaching team would preach it on Sunday morning. And so much of the curriculum out there does. And like you said, there's the character studies and, you know, slaying your own giants. And if we preached that portion of David's story, Andrew would say, this is not about you slaying your own giants. And so why would we choose a kids curriculum that does that, you know?
And kids is super funky because usually they're trying to summarize big stories into small things. Like I have this like a pictorial Bible for my son Ted, and my husband makes fun of me every time I read it because I'm like, they're missing the point of the story. Like they're missing huge chunks because it's just like, oh, the Good Samaritan was a nice person. And it's like, he's actually giving an indictment to the religious leaders. That's what the story's about, you know? So it's how a story summarizes the Bible is very important.
Ted, who is he a year and a half yet?
Yes.
Yeah, he's about a year and a half,
He
right?
needs to know about the indictment of
No,
Pharisees.
I'm saying he's going to be the kid in Sunday school that's like, excuse me, that is not what this is about.
Probably.
Yeah, there's that. Then there's also the moldability. And we're always, you know, I even say like some of the curriculum we're using right now isn't like the perfect thing we've ever found, you know? And so it's like, yeah, can we adjust this for our context?
Well, and for our teachers too,
Yeah.
it can be it can be a training for your teachers as well. Because it's like, oh, here's how you teach. And they're like, wow, like I didn't know that,
Yeah.
you know, it's how we go about that.
Yeah. And then I think, you know, some of the resources that surround it, like I taught in our kids' church a couple months ago, and the week I did had a really clear 5-minute video of the story that was in the passage we were teaching. I was like, oh, easy, hit play on that. And then so I don't have to like animatedly tell the story. You know, and so that's really helpful. So yeah, I think those are a few things to keep in mind. Looking at like Orange curriculum, like we had a season years and years ago where we used it. We had an interim kids minister who loved it, so we used it for a minute. I don't know anything about it really, and I don't know what this is, like the dangers of it, so I can't speak to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's expand the question a bit and say overall, like how can we discern what curriculum is best used in the church just in general?
Yeah, I think, like, you know, what I mentioned is just a Bible-based curriculum. I mean, there's so many reasons that you can gather as just random people, and like, but the church gathers to worship Christ and to hear from him and his word, you know? And so those things need to be central in there. And so, you know, early on, even when I was like, I had a year, I think I was in charge of kids ministry, and I was talking to people whose like whole jobs is to write curriculum and to teach teachers how to teach, you know, and they were like, the amount of time you spend on certain things in your gathering is going to point to like what you spend the most time on, you know. And so choosing a Bible-based curriculum, I think what's really important is in college we used to talk about which branches of the faith have their own canon in scriptures, you know. So it's like uber charismatic, you know, they focus on the gifts and Pentecost and that, but then like, you know, Reformed churches have a tendency to like sit in like Ephesians 2 and like we're just gonna stay in Ephesians the whole time, you know. And there's like this, but we have the whole canon of scripture, you know, and so let's cover the whole gamut. And so I think it came like some of the stuff that I've worked with curriculum came out of my own experience of like I essentially perceive the Old Testament and the New Testament as totally separate entities. And I remember when I learned that really all of the New Testament is both a referral, a plagiarism, and the ending of the story to the Old Testament. It was like, oh my gosh, it's all one story. So I'm always looking for a curriculum that unites the whole story, you know? So if we're in the Old Testament, it's going to show us how to connect to Christ. If you're in the New Testament, it's going to remind us of promises that God's already made. And it just like, it can flow both ways so that when kids, or students or adults or anybody, sees whatever they're in, they're seeing that it fits into a big narrative.
Yeah. So there's like, we know there's a bunch of church leaders that listen to this podcast. And so maybe you're in a spot like I am, where you're the one who is, like a group comes to you and says, hey, for our Bible study, for our college group, for our whatever, this is what we want to go through. Is it cool? Here's some just quick tips that I've used in order to quickly, discern whether or not it's a good resource for your church. The first thing I do with every resource is that, I just look at who wrote it. And sometimes I'm just like, oh, they wrote it? No, we're not doing it. Or they wrote it. It's going to be solid. Like I can just, you can tell that based on previous experience with stuff. If you don't know the author, one of the first things I do is I look at who endorsed it. Now that's not a foolproof way of going through it, because that we've talked on this podcast before about how the publishing industry works, and it's like people just like endorse things and stuff like that. But if 5 pastors that I know are solid endorse something, it's probably going to be on the right track.
Yeah.
The other thing I do is I look through their curriculum. I look for how they talk about Old Testament characters. Mm-hmm. I look at how they talk about salvation.
Yeah.
And then I look at just the different parts of scripture they're in, and I just like, okay, I'm really familiar with that, like that element of the story. Let's go read that one section and see, like, do they handle it like we know that our pastor would, like, or our teaching team would, or our elders would be comfortable with. And that's usually where I start. The other thing I do is, this is a real easy one, is just put the name of it and then the word review in Google, and you're going to get Amazon reviews, which I don't look at. You're going to get random reviews, which I don't look at. I look at blogs that have talked about it. And on pretty much every resource you can find, you'll find reviews that are like, here's why it's amazing. And you'll find reviews where here's why it's awful. And those will always tell me almost everything I need to know. Like, I was reviewing, I don't remember what it was. It was something recently. This negative review of it, actually gave me the confidence that it was going to be good, and I don't remember what the context was, but I remember reading this like review. It was like, this is how awful it is. And I was like, oh, that's actually like,
those are all good things.
We're going to be okay with this. And so, those are really helpful things. And cause there have been weeks where I'll have 7 resources on my desk for 5 different ministries. And it's like, hey, you need to like assess all these in the next 7 days. And it's like, I'm not reading a 300-page book that's a women's Bible study, like for moms, but how can I, and honestly, like, to the churches who might be like, oh yeah, we just like let ministries do whatever they want, it always backfires. Like, there's been a couple times where I felt like I had to say no to a ministry multiple times. And so I've said yes when I shouldn't have. I'm just like, okay, whatever. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Never turns out well.
Yeah.
Always people who get frustrated and I can't believe you chose that, but you wouldn't let us do this. And it's like, well, they both sucked, but I didn't want to fight with the leader anymore. And so, that's can be helpful in just picking curriculum in general.
I think sometimes trusted resources, like there's a couple of like, especially for like women's stuff, a couple of ladies that I know that are just like well read in it and they've got solid theology. They're trustworthy people. And so it's like, if they give me the thumbs up, I'm like, it's probably pretty good. And even just sometimes a good question to ask of a resource is like, what is their version of the gospel? Like, I remember there was a time where there was a super popular book. It was before Girl Wash Your Face. It was like perfect or imperfect or perfectly imperfect, something about being perfect or something. And like a bunch of women were reading at the time. I read the first 3 chapters and it was like, dude, the gospel is like, you're awesome and we'll help you get better. And it was like, this is so terrible, And it's like asking of the resource, like, what is your version of the gospel? And if it smells of the like, you are actually awesome, you just need to figure that out, then it's like, stop.
The other thing I do, I should mention this, is oftentimes the people who write these things are on staff at churches. I go to their church's website and see what they highlight. And that can tell you a lot too.
A lot of them probably have blogs too, or their own like article writing. All that.
Yeah, pretty good stuff. All right, last question before we get out of here. And it kind of is based off this, but we do value writing our own curriculum when we can. You've created an insane 3-year program. You've kind of written it and then rewritten it, the whole thing, right? That is for our middle schoolers. If somebody shows up first day of 6th grade, graduates 8th grade, over the course of those 3 years, they will hear the entire Bible taught in our middle school gatherings on Sunday morning. And so my daughter's in 6th grade. She started Tribes. And so by the time she's done with 8th grade, like, she will have gotten back to where she started. And you have an insane roster of teachers in there who, like, it's not that you sit there every Sunday morning and do it. It's a team of a bunch of folks that are doing it. So why do you value that, and like what's the benefit? And then second, what's like a piece of advice you would give to a church leader who's listening that's like, oh, I want to do that. How do I start?
Yeah. So the reason why I did it is at the time I was taking over middle school and I wanted a resource that was going to get our middle schoolers through the Bible in 3 years. And I was looking out there and there's a lot of stuff like, it's not the Bible Project, it's Lifeway's version of the kids curriculum.
Gospel Project?
The Gospel Project. So they have a kids track and a youth track. And so I dove into the youth track. Things I liked about it is it's like, I think they had a section that was like, basically a catechism, like here's 100 answers to questions that your students need to know. I was like, oh, that's pretty great. And it was like, oh, here's my memory verses. That's awesome. But as I dove into the overall narrative of the scriptures, it just like was not hitting things that I wanted. Plus, I'm assuming, which is not always the case, but I'm assuming that at least half of our kids in the room have come from our kids ministry. So they've probably gotten the classic stories of like David and Goliath, Noah and the ark. And so I wanted to take them into other stories in the Bible that you may not hit in kids or other things like that when I'm going through the different books. And so it just wasn't arcing in the way that I wanted to. And so really what I wanted and what I created was a curriculum that touches on 3 things. When a student leaves tribes, they should be able to know 3 things. They should be able to know the main idea of the entire Bible. So the whole meta narrative of the Bible. I phrase it in 3 phrases called the big purpose, the big problem, and big promise. They should know the whole main idea. They will know the main idea of every single book in the Bible. So this is why Leviticus is written. What's the main idea? Here's why Song of Songs. We went through Song of Songs. Why it's written and why it's there. So they should know the main idea of the story, the whole Bible of every book, how it all points back to Christ, and then specifically giving them tools to study the Bible. Because if my students, I think I had a mom early on. I had a mom tell me this, and one thing that you learn over the years of ministry is like you kind of take every criticism you can learn from every criticism. So I had a mom that was criticizing for how much stuff I had the kids memorize. She's like, it's great if they memorize stuff, but if they don't walk away in love with Jesus, what's the point? And I was like, okay. So like I want our students to be able to go home and open the Bible for themselves and feel confident that they can read it and know what they're reading. And so every lesson, every chunk of lessons. So we talk about the different genres: narrative, poetry, discourse. It's not what I call it for students, but like they have rules of how to study them, and so they're learning all these things. So I could even go into the room and be like, "What's a Bible study tool?" And they'll be like, "Repeated words," because we say it all the time, because I want them to be able to go home and read it. So those are the 3 things: is the main ideas, how it all points to Christ, and then Bible study tools. And so that's kind of just where I began. And so I began to break down the whole Bible that way, and then kind of broke it down different years. And like I said, we played with it for a year, and we've made some adjustments. Like even now, because what we're working on right now is what we actually originally wrote during COVID. So they're not very well crafted lessons for in-person because we did everything online. And so like I'm even renovating some of how that looks out as I'm seeing it in practice. But anyway, like I think getting started, it's a massive, massive project because it was like a 3-year project. And I think as a person writing curriculum, like if you're choosing to launch in that direction for whatever reason, what you see out there doesn't match what you want to renovate something that's out there, or you want something that matches your church culture, I would just say be wildly diligent in like writing down everything, like just everything. Like there are times, especially if you're a seasoned teacher or preacher, that it's like, okay, this lesson this week is on Ephesians. You're like, I know Ephesians super well. 4 bullet points, done. I'm going to get up there and I'm just going to teach it because I have to get it done this week, because the urgency of the weekly can sometimes hijack from like the necessary work to make things great. But then in hindsight, when you go back to like replicate that or share that with somebody, it's like you got nothing because you winged it in the moment, So it's like taking the extra hour, the extra couple hours to just really skillfully get it all on paper so that if that paper was handed to somebody else, they could teach it that day.
Yeah.
So those are my biggest regrets. It's part of why I've had to rewrite some of the stuff, because there were some weeks where I was just like, oh, I'll just do it. And then I needed to write it down.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, I don't know. I'm grateful that my daughter gets to go through tribes, and I mean, I have 3 more that are be there at some point, but yeah, it's pretty sweet. So thanks for being here today. This is good. If you have questions about this or anything else, you can hit us up. podcast@toBeTheChurch.com is the best spot to do it. You can also do it in the YouTube comments or on social media @toBeTheChurch. We'll see you next week.